In the summer of 1337, a farmer in northern France bent over his wheat and did not look up. He had no reason to. The sky was clear, the harvest was close. His father had worked this same strip of earth, and his father before him, and the border of the field had not moved in living memory. Whatever happened in the great halls of Paris or across the water in London was a rumor that never reached the soil. Kings were far away, wheat was near. He could not have known that the ground under his hands was about to become the most fought over earth in Europe, that his grandchildren would bury their own children in it, that the war beginning that year would outlast him and his son, and his son's son, that it would still be burning when no one alive could remember a single face that started it. And this is a long story, 116 years of it, more than a single sitting can hold. It will come to you in parts, the way the harvests came, one after another. If you would like each one to find you when it is ready, follow the Quiet Archive wherever you are now, on YouTube or in whatever player holds your quietest listening. It asks nothing of you, and it helps more than you would think, keeping these stories arriving on their own slow time. Now, back to the field and the wheat, and the last ordinary summer before the fire. He bent over his wheat, and somewhere north, two men were arguing over a chair. The chair was the throne of France, and the argument was very old. It began, as these things often do, with a family that could not make sons. For 300 years, the crown of France had passed cleanly from father to son, an unbroken line, the kind of luck no dynasty expects to keep. Then, in the space of 14 years, it ran out. 3 kings came and went, brothers one after another, and not one of them left a boy behind to follow him. The oldest and surest crown in Europe was suddenly a question. There was a claimant across the sea. His name was Edward III, King of England, and he was young, and he was angry, and he had a case. His mother was a French princess, sister to those 3 dead kings. By her blood, Edward argued, the crown of France belonged to him. He was the last king's nephew. The throne should pass through the woman to a son. The French lords looked at this English boy and gave their answer without much difficulty. In France, they said, the crown did not pass through a woman. It never had. A daughter could not inherit it, and so a daughter could not hand it to her son. The law was old, and the law was convenient, and the two things were not unrelated. So they gave the crown to a cousin instead. A man named Philip VI, French, safe, born on the right side of the rule. He was crowned in Reims, anointed with oil, and the matter was considered closed. It was not closed. Edward III was a king in his own right, and he held land in France, a wide, rich stretch of the southwest called Gascony, wine country, and it was his. But here was the trap that had waited under the whole arrangement for centuries. To hold that land, an English king had to kneel to the French king and call him lord. Edward, who believed the French crown was his by blood, was now expected to bow to the man wearing it. For a while he bowed. Kings are practical before they are proud. But the bowing curdled. Philip pressed at the edges of Gascony, took a castle here, a claim there, testing what the young Englishman would swallow. There were French ships raiding the English coast, burning fishing towns, and there were Scottish armies in the north that somehow always seemed to have French gold behind them. Every insult was small. Together, they were not small at all. And Edward had something Philip did not fully understand yet. He had a grievance that felt like a right. In his own mind, he was not a rebellious vassal. He was the true king of France, humiliated, kneeling to a usurper. A man who believes that can justify almost anything. In 1337, Philip made the mistake that turned pressure into war. He declared Gascony forfeit, announced that Edward's French lands were his to take. It was meant to bring the Englishmen to heel. It did the opposite. Edward answered by reaching back for the largest weapon he had. He stopped calling Philip his lord. He renewed the old claim in full, in writing, before the world. He, Edward, was the rightful king of France, and Philip was a pretender wearing a stolen crown. It was no longer about a province. It was about the throne itself. He did not know what he had started. No king ever does. He imagined a sharp campaign, a battle or two, a better bargain, the way wars had always gone. A season of fighting, a treaty, and home. That was the shape a war was supposed to have. The men who would die in this one had not yet been born. Back in his field, the farmer finished his row. The wheat came in that autumn, golden heavy, and was cut and stored the way it always had been. The border of his field had not moved, not yet. But far to the north, a king had sworn to take a crown, and another king had sworn to keep it. And between the two of them lay a whole country, its towns, its harvests, its rivers, and the patient earth that fed all of it. The earth did not know it had been promised to a war. It only knew the season. It would go on turning, green to gold, to barren green again, faithful as it had always been. And each time it turned, there would be less of the old world left to remember why the fighting had ever begun. The war began, as most of Edward's war would, with fire on water. For 3 years after the claim was made, very little happened that looked like a war. There were threats, alliances bought and sold, money borrowed against money not yet earned. Edward III spent a fortune. He did not have stitching together allies in the Low Countries, princes who would fight for France's enemy as long as English gold kept arriving. War in those years was less a clash than a negotiation held at knife point. Then, in the summer of 1340, the two kings finally reached for each other, and they reached across the sea. Philip VI had gathered a fleet, a great crowded mass of ships in the harbour of Sluys, off the coast of Flanders. So many holes packed so tightly that a man might almost have walked from one shore of the inlet to the other across their decks. It was meant to command the channel. It was meant to keep Edward's army from ever crossing to the continent at all. The French chained their ships together in ranks, a floating wall, a fortress made of timber and rope. It was a decision made by men who thought of the sea as a kind of land. Edward came at them with the wind and the tide behind him, and he came with archers. This is the first time the longbow enters the story, and it enters quietly, before anyone understood what it was. The English ships carried men who could draw a bow taller than themselves, and send an arrow through mail at 200 paces, and send another before the first had landed, and another. Against the chained French fleet, packed, immobile, unable to turn or flee, the arrows fell like a hard rain that did not stop. The battle lasted most of a day. The French could not maneuver. They had built themselves a wall and then could not move it. English archers cleared the decks, and English men-at-arms boarded across the bodies, ship by chained ship. By evening, the water of the inlet had changed color. A grim joke went around afterward that if the fish of Sluys could speak, they would speak French now, for all the Frenchmen they had swallowed. It was a great victory, and it decided the sea, and it decided almost nothing else. Because a war is not won on water, it is won on land, in fields, in villages, in the slow arithmetic of who can feed an army and who can burn the other's food. And here, Edward discovered the thing that would shape the next 100 years more than any battle. He discovered how hard it is to actually win. He had a claim to the throne of France. What he did not have was a way to make France agree. He could land an army, he could march it. But Philip would not come out and fight, not on Edward's terms, not where the longbows waited. A French king could simply withdraw behind his walls, let the seasons pass, and watch the expensive English army run out of money and go home. Sieges were slow, castles were many. Time was on the side of the man defending his own country. So Edward reached for the only weapon that worked when the enemy would not fight. He reached for fire. The word the French would come to dread was chevauchée, a ride. It sounds almost gentle. It was not. A chevauchée was an army let loose across the countryside for no purpose but ruin. Not to take towns, not to hold ground, to burn it. Villages, barns, mills, the standing crops in the fields, the vineyards, the livestock, everything that fed a region, put to the torch and left as ash. An army moving fast, destroying everything it could not carry, and moving on before anything could stop it. The logic was cold and it was clever. A king who could not protect his own people was not much of a king. Every burned village was an argument. Every ruined harvest asked the same question of the French crown. What good is your protection? Edward could not defeat Philip in the field, but he could make Philip's kingdom worthless, one valley at a time, until either the French came out to fight or the French stopped believing in their king. And so the fire came to the farmer's country. It did not come as a battle, with banners and a name that history would remember. It came as smoke on the horizon one morning, and horsemen in the lane by afternoon, and by nightfall the barns were gone, and the grain was gone, and the year's work was black in the fields. There was no glory in it, and no chronicle wrote it down, because it happened 1,000 times over, in 1,000 nameless places, to people whose names no one recorded. The land that had turned faithfully from green to gold now learned a third color. The fields did not burn like the ones in the songs, quickly and cleanly. Wet grain smolders. It takes its time. A burned field smokes for days, and the smell settles into everything, and it does not fully leave until the rain comes. The soil would recover. Soil always does. Ash is not the end of a field. In a strange way, it feeds the next crop, and within a year or two, the green would come back, patient and blind, over ground that had been made to starve a kingdom. But the people who had worked it did not always come back. Some fled. Some did not survive the winter that followed a burned autumn. And those who stayed learned the new arithmetic of the age, that a full barn was a target, that a harvest was a thing the war could take, that the border of a field meant nothing at all to a man on a horse with a torch. The war had found its true shape now. Not the clash of kings on the water, the slow burning of the country underneath them. There would be a great battle soon, a real one, on land, with a name. It was coming, and it would break something that had stood for 500 years. But the fire came first. The fire always came first. On the morning of the 26th of August, 1346, the flower of French chivalry rode toward a low ridge in Picardy, and by nightfall, most of it was dead in the mud. The English had spent the summer doing what they knew how to do. Edward III had landed in Normandy and burned his way east, town after town, harvest after harvest. The long smear of smoke that told Philip VI exactly where his enemy was and exactly what his enemy was doing to his kingdom. It was the chevauchée again, ruin as argument, and this time it worked. Philip could no longer sit behind his walls and wait. His nobles would not stand for it. A king who let this happen was no king at all. So the French came out to fight. which was what Edward had wanted all along. The English were not looking for a battle so much as a good place to be caught. Edward found it near a village called Crecy, a gentle slope, his back to a wood, his flanks protected, high ground looking down over the ground the French would have to climb. He put his men on the ridge and waited. He had perhaps 12,000. Philip was coming with far more. On paper it was no contest. The French army was the greatest in Christendom, and at its heart rode the mounted knight, the armored noble on the armored horse, the single most fearsome thing on any battlefield in Europe for 500 years. A charge of heavy cavalry was the closing argument of medieval war. Nothing had ever reliably stood against it. It was not merely a weapon. It was an entire order of the world. The belief that a man born to fight on horseback was worth 100 men born to dig. Edward met it with men born to dig. His army was built around the longbow, and the longbow was not a noble weapon. It took no bloodline to draw one, only a lifetime of practice, begun in boyhood, that thickened the bones of a man's drawing arm and left him lopsided for life. English and Welsh commoners had been shooting since they could stand. They were farmers and shepherds and poachers, and they could put an arrow through a knight's armor, or through the horse beneath him. At a distance the knight could not answer. The French arrived late in the day, tired, strung out along the road, their ranks confused. Wiser counsel said to wait for morning, but the knights had ridden a long way to kill Englishmen, and they could see the Englishmen right there, and no one was going to tell the greatest cavalry on earth to sit and wait. They came on as they arrived, piecemeal, uphill, into the last of the daylight. The arrows began before the horses reached the line. What happened then was not a battle in the way the knights understood the word. It was a killing. The sky went dark with shafts falling faster than anyone could count, and the horses screamed and reared and threw their riders, and the ones behind rode into the ones falling in front, and the whole magnificent charge folded in on itself in a heap of thrashing animals and armored men who could not rise. A knight in full plate, thrown into mud, pinned under his own horse, was not a warrior anymore. He was a turtle on its back, waiting. And the English came down off the ridge with knives. They charged again anyway. That is the part that is hard to understand from outside their world. The French knights saw the first wave die, and the second, and they charged again and again, 15 times some say, wave after wave into the arrows, all through the evening and into the dark. Not because it was working, because to be a knight was to charge. To turn away was a shame worse than death, and they had been raised to believe that with their whole hearts, they died of what they believed. By the time it ended, the ground below the ridge was carpeted. The dead were not foot soldiers. They were the names of France, counts, lords, the King of Bohemia among them, a blind old man who had asked to be led into the fighting so that he might strike one blow, and was, and did, and died. Philip VI himself was wounded and dragged from the field in the dark, weeping. His army destroyed, his knighthood destroyed, by farmers with sticks. Something ended at Crecy, and it was larger than an army. For 5 centuries, the mounted knight had been the master of war, and the master of war had been the master of everything, the lord, the ruler, the man who mattered, set above the men who worked the land because he alone could fight. Crecy put an arrow through that idea. A commoner could now kill the finest knight in France before the knight got close enough to lift his sword. The world in which birth decided worth had met a weapon that did not care about birth. No one said this out loud on the ridge that night. The English were too tired, and the French were too dead. It would take a very long time for anyone to understand what had changed. Kings and lords would spend the next 100 years pretending it had not, riding to the same kind of death on other fields, learning nothing. Because the thing the longbow threatened was not their lives, it was their reason to rule. The bodies were stripped and left. The local people would have buried what they could in the way they always did, in the earth of a field that had grown something else the year before and would grow something again the year after. It was good ground for a battle, the chroniclers agreed. The slope, the wood, the high dry footing. They did not mention what it had been before it was a battlefield. No one ever did. But a slope like that, gentle and south-facing, was not chosen only by kings. A farmer would have known it too. Would have known it was fine ground, the kind you were glad to inherit, the kind that took the sun and drained clean and gave you a little more than the field next door. It gave a good harvest that year, of a kind. Edward III did not chase the broken French army. He turned north instead, toward the coast, toward a walled town called Calais, and there he stopped and did the thing he was actually good at. He waited. Calais mattered for a single reason. It was close. It was the nearest French port to England, a day's sail across the narrowest part of the Channel, and a king who held it held a door, a permanent way into France that did not depend on wind or luck or a friendly ally. Edward wanted that door, so he sat down in front of the town in the autumn of 1346, fresh from the slaughter at Crecy, and prepared to take it the slow way. The slow way was starvation. Calais was too strong to storm. Its walls were high, and its garrison was stubborn, and its marshy ground made a direct assault a way to lose an army for nothing. Edward knew this, and so he did not try. He built a town of his own outside the walls instead, a whole wooden settlement of huts and markets and workshops with its own streets, where his soldiers could live through the winter. He ringed the harbor so no ship could bring the defenders food. And then he let time do the work that swords could not. This is the other face of the war, the one the songs never sing. For every hour of a battle like Crecy, there were months of this, of sitting, of waiting, of hunger used as a tool. A siege was not heroic, it was arithmetic. So many mouths inside the walls, so much grain in the storehouses, and a slow line drawn down toward the day the two numbers met. Everyone inside Calais could do that arithmetic. So could Edward. The whole business was a matter of watching a town do the sum on itself. Inside the walls, the sum came due by degrees. The people of Calais held out with a stubbornness that is hard to imagine now. They held out through the winter and through the spring and into a second summer, 11 months in all. They ate their horses. They ate the animals. No one eats until there is nothing else. The governor, to make the food last, did the cold arithmetic himself. He put the mouths that could not fight outside the gates, the old, the sick, hundreds of them, the useless, in the language of a siege, and sent them out to Edward, because a mouth that could not hold a wall was only a faster line to starvation. Edward would not let them pass. They sat in the ditch between the town and the English camp, in the no man's land, and there they stayed, belonging to neither side, fed by neither side. Some accounts say the English gave them a meal out of pity and then left them to it. They died there, in the gap, in view of the walls they had been born behind. It was not cruelty exactly. It was the logic of the siege followed to its end. A siege has no room for mercy because mercy costs food, and food was the whole war. When it finally became clear that no French army was coming to save them, Philip had marched close, looked at the English position and marched away again, unwilling to risk another Crecy. Calais gave up. And here, the war produced one of its strange human moments. the kind that survives when the names of battles blur. Edward was in a fury. The town had cost him 11 months and a fortune, and had defied him the whole way, and he wanted it punished. He agreed to spare the townspeople on one condition: that 6 of the leading citizens come out to him, bareheaded, barefoot, with ropes already tied around their necks, carrying the keys of the town, and place themselves entirely in his hands, to be hanged, everyone understood, as the price of the rest. 6 men volunteered. The richest men in Calais, who had the most to lose and lost it, walked out through the gate they had held for 11 months, stripped of their fine clothes, nooses at their throats, and knelt in front of the English king, and offered him their lives for the lives of everyone behind them. The burghers of Calais, they are called, and they are remembered because for once someone wrote it down. 6 specific men, with names out of the thousands the war swallowed without a record. Edward meant to kill them. He was talked out of it, the story goes, by his own wife, the Queen, who was heavily pregnant and fell to her knees before her husband and begged for the 6 men's lives. An act of mercy, carefully staged perhaps, a way for a king to be talked into the clemency he could not afford to offer himself. The burghers lived. The town was emptied of its French people and filled with English settlers, and it became what Edward wanted: an English town on French soil, a door held open, a foothold that England would keep for 200 years, long after everything else was lost. It was a victory. It was even, in its way, a decisive one. But it had been won without a battle, without a charge, without a single arrow after the walls went up. It had been won by hunger, patiently applied, until a town ate itself down to the point of surrender. And the country around Calais, the fields and farms that had fed the town before the English ring closed around it, had been stripped bare to feed the besiegers instead. An army that size does not carry 11 months of food. It takes it from the land, from the same farms and the same harvests, the same green to gold earth that had already learned the torch. A siege does not only starve the people inside the walls, it hollows out everything for miles around quietly to keep the besiegers fed while they wait. The door was open now. Edward had his way into France, held by English hands, and he could come and go as he pleased. He would not need it for a while, because something was already moving toward France that no war could keep out, no siege could starve, and no army could fight. It was coming up out of the south, out of the ports, carried in the holds of ships, along with the grain and the wine. It would do in 2 years what the war had not managed in 10, and it did not care whose side anyone was on. It came ashore in the ports first, the way trade always does, and at first no one connected the ships to the dying. By the time it reached the war, the plague had already crossed half the world. It had come out of the east along the roads and the sea lanes, through the great trading cities, riding in the holds of grain ships among the rats and the fleas that no one yet knew to fear. It reached the southern coast of France in the winter, and it did not spread so much as fall, town after town, each one certain it would be spared, each one wrong within a month. The war simply stopped, not by treaty, not by anyone's decision. It stopped because you cannot fight a war when a third of everyone is dying, when the tax collectors are dead, and the soldiers are dead, and the men who would have marched are shivering and black-fingered in beds. No one will come near. Edward III put away his claim to the throne of France for a while, because there was no France left to conquer in any shape worth having, and no England left to conquer it with. The 2 kings who had spent a decade trying to ruin each other now watched a thing arrive that ruined them both, evenly, without preference. What the plague did to the countryside is the part of this story that is hardest to hold in the mind, because it did not look like the war. The war left smoke and bodies and burned barns, visible ruin, the kind you could point to. The plague left something stranger. It left the fields standing. The crops came up that spring, as they always had. No one had burned them. No army had trampled them. They rose green and ordinary out of the good earth, on their own schedule, indifferent as ever. And there was no one to bring them in. The people who would have cut that wheat were in the ground beside it. Whole villages emptied in a season, not fled, not marched away, simply dead. And the doors left open, and the animals wandering, and the grain ripening gold in the sun over fields that had no one left to want it. This was a new color for the land, and it was the quietest one yet. It had been green. It had been the gold of harvest. It had been black with the torch and red under the ridge at Crecy. Now it was gold again, but a gold no one gathered. A harvest that stood and ripened and rotted where it grew, because the hands that belonged to it were gone. A burned field is a wound. A field that no one comes to is something worse. It is a field that has outlived the people who loved it. The dying did not care whose land it crossed. It killed in Paris and it killed in London. It killed the French farmer and the English archer, the noble in his hall and the beggar at his gate. And it killed them at rates that broke the ordinary machinery of grief. There were too many dead to bury properly. There were too many dead to mourn one at a time. In the worst months, in the worst places, perhaps half the people alive in the spring were gone by the autumn. Half. A number the mind refuses and turns away from and cannot really hold. No one knew why. That is the thing to sit with. They did not know about the fleas or the rats or the bacteria in the blood. They only knew that death moved through a house like a smell, that to nurse the sick was often to join them, that a person could be well at dawn and dead by dark. So they reached for the explanations they had. It was the wrath of God. It was poisoned air. It was the sin of the age being answered. It was the fault of strangers, of outsiders, of whichever neighbors were already hated. And in that terror, people did terrible things to each other, looking for someone to blame for a thing that had no face and took no sides. And then, slowly, over 2 or 3 years, it burned down to embers, the way these things do. Not because anyone defeated it, because it ran out of the living, thinned the world until it could no longer spread so fast, and receded, leaving behind a Europe with great holes torn in it, whole regions half empty, fields without farmers, and farms without heirs. Here is the strange arithmetic the plague left behind. So many were dead that the ones who lived were suddenly worth more. A man who could work the land was rare now, and a rare thing can ask a price. The survivors could demand better wages, better terms, could walk away from a bad lord and find a good one, because there were empty farms everywhere begging for hands. The old order, the one already cracked at Crecy, the one that said a man's worth was fixed at his birth, took a second blow it never fully recovered from. The plague did not care about the social order any more than the longbow had. It simply killed enough people that the order could no longer hold its shape. The war would come back. Of course it would. The kings were still kings. The claim was still a claim. And a thing like that does not die just because a third of the men who might have fought it did. When the dying eased and the harvest steadied, and there were once again enough young men to put in the field, the old quarrel was waiting exactly where it had been left, patient as the earth. But the men who took it up again were not the men who had put it down. A whole generation had been thinned. The war that resumed was inherited, handed to sons who had buried their fathers, not on a battlefield, but in a plague pit, and who picked up a fight already old, already strange, already harder to explain than it had been the year it began. The fields, for their part, came back the way fields do. The rot fed the soil. The empty villages filled again slowly, with new people or with no one. And the wheat rose the next year, and the year after, golden, faithful and blind, over ground that had held a harvest no one gathered, and would soon, once more, hold armies. The Black Prince had 4,000 men, and they were tired, and they were hungry, and they were trapped, and by the end of the day, the King of France was his prisoner. 10 years had passed since Crécy. The plague had come and gone, and come again in smaller waves, and the men fighting now were not quite the men who had fought before. Philip VI was dead. His son sat on the French throne, John II, called John the Good, though the name meant good in the old sense of brave and well-born, not good in the sense of wise. And across the war, Edward III had a son grown to manhood, a soldier already famous, a hard and brilliant young commander the French had learned to dread. History would call him the Black Prince, for the colour of his armour or the darkness of his reputation. No one is quite sure which. In the autumn of 1356, the Black Prince was doing what his father had taught him. He was riding through the heart of France with a small army, burning as he went. The chevauchée again, the old cruel argument written across the countryside in smoke. But this time he had ridden too far and stayed too long, and a great French army had come up behind him and cut him off from safety, near a town called Poitiers. Now the arithmetic ran the other way. The Black Prince was outnumbered, perhaps 2 to 1 or worse. His men were burdened with plunder and short of food. The French had him where he could not run. King John had only to wait, to press, to close the trap, and the finest young commander in England would be forced to surrender or be destroyed. The son of Edward III, handed to France in chains, would have been a prize to answer for a generation of humiliation. The Black Prince knew all of this. He offered terms. He offered to give back everything he had taken, all the plunder, all the prisoners, and to swear not to fight France for 7 years, if only he were let go. He was not being noble, he was being realistic. He thought he was going to lose. King John refused. He wanted the whole army and its famous prince, and nothing less. He had the numbers and the ground and the enemy in a corner, and he meant to end it. It was the reasonable choice. It was, on paper, the right one. But John had learnt the wrong lesson from Crécy, or no lesson at all. The French attacked much as they had 10 years before, into a strong English position, into ground the archers had chosen, uphill against the longbow. There were more knights on foot this time, some effort to adapt, but the shape of the disaster was the same. The arrows came, the charges broke. The French crowded forward into a narrow front where their numbers could not tell, and the English archers, when their arrows finally ran low, threw down their bows, took up whatever they could hold, and waded in among the exhausted French on foot. And in the confusion of the day, the impossible happened. The line held. Then the English counter-attacked, and the great French army, winning, by every reasonable measure an hour before, came apart. Men fled. The reserves melted. And in the wreck of it, King John of France found himself alone but for a knot of loyal men, fighting on foot, surrounded, with his youngest son beside him, a boy of 14, calling out warnings to his father in the press. "Father, guard your right. Father, guard your left." They took him alive. That was the thing that made Poitiers echo where 100 burned villages did not. Not the dead. The war made dead by the 1,000. It was the living king, the anointed sovereign of France, the man on whom the whole order of the kingdom rested, was a captive in an English tent, and would be taken across the water to London to be paraded through the streets and lodged in comfort and held for a ransom so vast it could barely be spoken. Think about what that did to France. Not the loss of a battle. France could lose battles. This was the loss of the head itself. A medieval kingdom was held together by the person of its king. The king was the state, the law, the point around which everything turned. And now the point was gone, carried off, a guest in his enemy's capital, unable to rule, unable to lead, worth more as a hostage than he had ever been worth on the throne. France did not fall into war. France fell into something worse, into the absence of anyone in charge. With the king in London and his ransom bleeding the treasury white, the kingdom began to come apart from the inside. The taxes to pay for his freedom fell hardest on the people who could least bear them, on the same farmers who had already given the war their harvests and their sons. And the countryside, squeezed past endurance, began to turn on the nobles who had failed to protect it and now demanded it pay for their defeat. Because that was the quiet verdict of Poitiers, the one no herald announced. The knights had one job in the order of the world. They fought, and in exchange the people fed them and obeyed them. That was the bargain that justified everything. And at Poitiers, the knights had not merely lost. They had lost with the king in their midst and let him be taken, and then sent the bill for their failure down to the villages. The people who worked the land looked up at the men who ruled them and saw, for the first time clearly, that the bargain was broken. The men on horseback could not even keep their own king safe. King John would sit in London for years, an honored prisoner, learning to like his captivity, while behind him his kingdom shook. His ransom would be one of the largest sums ever named in the medieval world, and France would break itself trying to pay it. And the men who now truly ruled France, the ones left holding a headless kingdom, would have to find a new way to fight a war. Their king could not lead from a cell across the sea. They would find it. It would look nothing like Crécy or Poitiers. It would have no glory in it at all. But first, the broken country would have to survive what its own despair was about to do to it. In the spring of 1360, the war ended. Everyone said so. There was a treaty, and there was a great deal of gold, and there was a king going home, and for once, it truly looked like the finish. France could not go on. That was the plain fact behind the peace. With King John a prisoner in London and the countryside in open misery, the kingdom had spent 3 years coming apart. The peasants had risen in a great, doomed fury. The jacquerie, they called it, a spasm of rage from people pushed past the edge, who turned on the nobles that had failed them, and were put down with a savagery that made the original cruelty look mild. Bands of soldiers left unpaid and unemployed by the lull in the war had turned to simple banditry, roaming the country, living off whatever they could take. A plague of armed men where the other plague had passed. France in these years was not so much at war as dissolving. And into this, the English pressed their advantage. Edward III launched one more great campaign, marching on Paris itself, meaning to finish it, to be crowned King of France in Reims, in the cathedral where French kings were made, and end the whole long argument by simply becoming the thing he claimed to be. It did not happen. Reims shut its gates and would not open them, and the countryside had been so thoroughly stripped by years of war that Edward's own army began to starve outside the walls it could not take. Then, on a spring day in open country, a storm broke over the English camp. A freak, savage hail, lightning killing men and horses, cold rain turning to a killing chill. Black Monday, they called it. Edward, soaked and battered, and unable to feed his men or take his city, seems to have taken it as a sign. He had won every battle and could not win the war. It was time to make a deal. The deal was the Treaty of Bretigny, and on its face it was a triumph for England so complete that it should have ended everything. Edward would get land, not scraps, but a full third of France, the whole rich southwest, held in full sovereignty, his own to rule with no French king above him. He would get Calais outright, the door he had already forced open. He would get John's ransom, an enormous mountain of gold, to be paid over years. It was everything the chevauchee had been arguing for, everything the arrows at Crécy and Poitiers had been trying to win. A vast English realm carved out of France, and a French king who had signed it all away to buy his freedom. And in exchange, Edward gave up one thing: the claim, the crown itself. He agreed to stop calling himself King of France, to let the throne be, in return for holding a third of the country as his own, without owing homage for it. The quarrel that had started the whole war, who was the rightful king, was to be set down at last. Each side would take what it held and call it settled. King John came home. The gold began to move. English officials rode south to take up their new lands, and French ones rode away, and the maps were redrawn. Men who had known nothing but war for 23 years began, cautiously, to believe it was over. A whole generation exhaled. You can almost feel the shape of an ending here. The wronged king got his lands. The captured king got his freedom. The long argument was resolved by dividing the thing everyone had fought over. If this were a story someone had invented, it might stop right here. A hard peace, dearly bought, but a peace, with both sides too exhausted to want anything but rest. The kind of ending that lets everyone go back to their fields. And for a little while, that is exactly what it looked like. The fighting eased. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the great campaigns stopped, and the armies thinned, and in the places the war had not touched too badly, the ordinary rhythm crept back. Seed went into the ground. The old work resumed. In a village that had lost its barns and its young men and half its people to plague, the survivors did the only thing there was to do, which was to begin again, to clear the burned ground, to plant what they had, to bring in a harvest that no army came to take. For a few years, the earth turned the way it was meant to, green to gold, to bare and green, and the smoke stayed off the horizon, and a child born in those years might grow to walking age without ever seeing a soldier. It felt like the end, because everyone needed it to be the end. That is worth remembering. The peace was real to the people living in it. They were not fools waiting for the next blow. They were exhausted human beings taking the rest they had been given, planting in ground that had finally stopped shaking, raising children in a quiet they had every reason to trust. But look closely at what the treaty had actually done, and the quiet has a flaw running through it, fine as a crack in a bell. Edward had given up the crown, but the clauses that were supposed to make it final, the formal renunciations, were left hanging, never quite completed, never fully sealed. It was the kind of unfinished paperwork that means nothing in a time of peace and everything in a time of war. Both kings had signed. Neither had entirely let go. The claim was set down, but it was set down within reach. King John, for his part, would not even see the peace tested. He went back to London, voluntarily, astonishingly, out of honor, when a hostage sent in his place broke faith and fled. He returned to his comfortable captivity and died there, a prisoner by choice, and France passed to his son. His son was watching everything. He had seen his father captured, seen the kingdom nearly dissolve, seen the humiliating treaty signed. He was not a warrior like the men of Crecy. He was something the war had not yet faced, patient, careful, cold, and he had no intention of letting a third of France stay in English hands. The peace held for 9 years. The fields came back. A generation caught its breath. And the crown that Edward had set down within reach was still quietly within reach. The son who had watched everything now sat on the throne of France, and he did not pick up a sword. He picked up a map and a ledger and a very long patience. Charles V was nothing like the kings the war had produced so far. He was not a warrior. His body was weak. He had trouble with his hands, swelling in his limbs, the look of a man older than his years. And he had no intention of leading a charge into English arrows, because he had watched where that led. He had seen his grandfather broken at Crécy in the telling of it, seen his father taken at Poitiers with his own eyes, seen the treaty that gave away a third of the kingdom. He had learned the one lesson none of the knights had managed to learn. You do not beat the longbow by riding at it. You beat it by never giving it a target. So Charles built a different kind of war, and it was almost the opposite of a war as his age understood the word. He rebuilt the things that had rotted, the treasury, the tax system, the machinery of a state that could pay soldiers year after year instead of raising a doomed army once and watching it starve. He built a navy. He strengthened the walls of his towns. And for the fighting itself, he found the right man. And the right man was as far from a shining knight as the age could offer. Bertrand du Guesclin was a Breton, ugly by every account, low-born by the standards of the men he would command, a brawler who had risen on skill alone in a world that was supposed to reward blood over skill. He was not chivalrous. He did not care about the beautiful set-piece battle where knights met knights in the open and the better men won. He thought that kind of war was for fools, and the evidence of 2 generations was on his side. What du Guesclin understood was that you could win a war without winning a battle. His method was patient and unglamorous and deadly. He avoided the great clash the English wanted. When an English army marched out, burning, looking for the decisive fight that had won them, Crécy and Poitiers, du Guesclin would not give it to them. He shadowed them instead. He let them march and burn and exhaust themselves and find nothing to fight. And then he took back what they had passed through, the castles, the towns, one at a time, by siege and negotiation and surprise, behind the enemy's back. He picked off garrisons. He bought off captains. He struck where the English were weak and vanished where they were strong. He turned the whole logic of the chevauchée inside out. Because the terrible flaw in the English way of war had been there all along, hidden under the victories. They could win any battle. They could not hold any ground. An army that burns a province and rides on does not own that province. It only owns the road it is standing on, for as long as it stands there. The moment the English army moved, everything behind it was French again, unless the English left a garrison, and every garrison was a handful of men in a hostile country, waiting for a Breton to come in the night. Crécy and Poitiers had won nothing but reputation. Reputation does not hold a castle. And so, through the late years of the 1360s and into the 1370s, the map quietly changed color. Not in a day, not in a battle anyone could name, but town by town, season by season. The third of France that Bretigny had handed to England began, silently, to come home. The English holdings shrank. The great triumphant peace of 1360 was being unmade, not by defeat, but by erosion, by a war that offered the English nothing to beat. For the English, it was maddening beyond words. They still had the longbow. They still won the field whenever the French were foolish enough to give them a field, which now they never were. Edward III was old now, and ailing, and the Black Prince, the terror of Poitiers, was dying slowly of a sickness he had caught on campaign, wasting away while the lands he had won slipped back through his fingers. The greatest soldiers of the age stood fully armed and watched their conquests dissolve, and there was nothing to swing a sword at. You cannot win a battle that the other man refuses to fight. This is the strangest stretch of the whole long war, and the easiest to pass over, because nothing happens in it that a chronicler loves. There is no Crecy here, no captured king, no single day that changes everything. There is only the slow, grinding, patient reversal of a decade of English triumph by a sick king and an ugly Breton who understood that time, not glory, wins a war. And it worked. By the time it was done, England held little more than the coastline it had started from, Calais, and a strip of the southwest, and the bitter memory of having held so much more. For the land it meant something particular, and something cruel. A war of raids and sieges and shadowing armies does not spare the countryside. It feeds on it endlessly from both directions. The English burned as they marched. The French lived off the same land as they followed. The garrisons requisitioned what they needed to hold their castles, and the men who besieged those garrisons requisitioned what they needed to take them. There was no great battle to devastate a region all at once, and so instead there was a slow bleeding of it, year upon year, the harvests taken and taken again by whichever armed men passed through that season. The people who worked the ground in these years learned that peace and war were no longer even separate things. There was no front line to be behind. There was only the country, and armies moving through it in every direction, and the certainty that whatever you grew, someone with a weapon would come for a share of it. The war had stopped being an event that arrived and departed. It had become the weather, a condition of the world you were born into and planted around and did not expect to see the end of. Charles V died in 1380, and Du Guesclin died the same year, and between them they had won back most of what Crécy and Poitiers and Bretigny had lost. The great English Empire in France was a memory. It should have been the end again. France restored, England spent, the argument decided by exhaustion in France's favor. But a war that has become the weather does not end because two men who fought it have died. It had outlived its beginning already. Now it began to outlive the very people who had turned its tide, passing on as it always did, to sons and grandsons who inherited a fight they had not started and could no longer quite explain. And in the quiet after Charles V, in the long truce that followed, France made the mistake of relaxing. It got a king who was a child, and then a king who was mad, and the whole patient structure that one careful man had built began slowly to come undone. There was a king of France now who believed he was made of glass. His name was Charles VI, and he had come to the throne as a boy of 11 when his careful father died, and for a while he had been golden, handsome, beloved, called Charles the Well-Beloved by a people desperate for a king to love. And then, in his 20s, riding through a forest on a hot day, something in his mind broke. He drew his sword and killed several of his own men before he could be stopped, screaming, not knowing them. It passed, and then it came back and passed, and came back again for the rest of his life. The madness took many shapes over 30 years. There were long stretches where he did not know his own name, or his wife, or his children. There were months when he would not bathe or change his clothes. And there was the delusion that gave the age its strangest image of a king. The conviction, seizing him for weeks at a time, that his body was made of glass, that he might shatter at any touch, and so he would let no one near him, and had rods of iron sewn into his clothing to keep himself from breaking. The King of France, the living center of the whole kingdom, the point on which everything was supposed to rest, spent much of his reign terrified that he was about to fall to pieces. And a kingdom whose center is a man who thinks he is made of glass, does not hold together well. This is the hollow at the heart of the Long War, the stretch of years where nothing was decided because there was no one hole enough to decide it. The great campaigns had stopped. There was a truce with England, an exhausted lull that lasted for years, and if you looked only at the treaties, you might think the war had faded away. It had not. It had only sunk beneath the surface into the bones of the country and gone on being paid for by the people who always paid. Because France did not stop bleeding just because the armies stopped marching. With a mad king who could not rule, the great lords of the kingdom fell to fighting over who would rule in his place. His brother against his cousins, faction against faction, the royal uncles carving up the treasury and the power between them. It curdled over the years into something worse than rivalry. It became a feud and then a blood feud, when one royal duke had another murdered in the streets of Paris, and the kingdom split into two armed camps that hated each other more than either hated England. France in these years was not fighting its enemy, it was fighting itself over the body of a king who did not always know there was a France at all. And underneath the lords and their feud, underneath the mad king in his iron-lined clothes, the country went on the way it always did. Now, this is the thing that is hard to feel across so many centuries. How long this went on. Not a battle, not a campaign, just years and then decades of a country that had never known anything else. Think of a child born in a village in these years. His grandfather had been born into war. His father had been born into war. He was born into it too, and to him it was not an event, not a thing that had started and would end. It was simply how the world was arranged. There were armed men, and there were taxes for armies, and there were seasons when you hid what you had grown, and seasons when they took it anyway. And there were stories the old people told of a time before, which he heard the way we hear stories of a golden age, as something that might never really have existed. Ask that child what the war was about, and he could not have told you. Neither could his father. The quarrel that had started it all, a claim to a throne, a king's nephew against a king's cousin, blood against law, was by now more than 60 years gone. The men who had made that claim were long dead. Edward III was dead. The Black Prince was dead. Philip and John and Charles V were all dead, and Du Guesclin, and everyone who had stood at Crécy or ridden at Poitiers or signed at Bretigny. The reason had outlived every single person who held it, and passed down through the generations, growing thinner each time, until it was no longer a reason at all. It was just the war. It was just how things were. That is what happens to a cause that lives too long. It stops being a cause and becomes an inheritance, handed from father to son like a piece of land or a family debt, carried by people who never chose it and cannot say why they carry it, only that it is theirs and always has been. Nobody was fighting for Edward III's claim anymore. Edward III was 3 generations in the ground. They were fighting because there was a war, and there was a war because there had always been a war, and the beginning had dissolved so completely that the thing had become its own reason. The land had changed under all this, quietly, in a way no chronicle recorded. Whole districts that had been rich were poor now. Fields that generations of a family had worked stood empty. The family scattered or dead, or fled to the safety of a walled town. And the forest crept back in over the old furrows, erasing the shape of them. In places the war and the plague together had taken so much that the countryside was simply emptier than it had been, wider and wilder and lonelier, the works of people thinning back into the trees. But the fields that were still worked were still worked. That is the stubborn miracle at the bottom of all of it. Somewhere, every one of these years, a farmer bent over his wheat the way his great-grandfather had before the first fire ever came, because the alternative to planting was starving, and the earth, whatever passed over it, still answered the season. The wheat still came up green and turned gold and was cut and stored, in the good years, in the years the armies passed elsewhere. The border of a field still meant nothing to a man on a horse, and the harvest was still a thing that might be taken. But it was still brought in by someone most years, because it had to be. The war had become the ground itself now, not a storm crossing the country, but the soil everyone stood on, the condition they were born into and planted around and expected to hand down. It had swallowed its own beginning. It had swallowed the men who began it, and the men who turned it, and everyone who could remember why. It looked, in these grey, exhausted years of a mad king in a divided country, less like a war than like a permanent feature of the world, something that had always been and always would be. It was about to be proven wrong on the second count. Across the water, in a kingdom that had lost almost everything its grandfathers won, a young king was reading old treaties. He had found the unfinished paperwork of Bretigny, the renunciations never quite sealed, the claim Edward had set down within reach, and he had decided that a divided France, ruled by a man who thought he was made of glass, was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. 70 years after Crecy, on a wet October field, the French rode into the English arrows again, and died the same death their great-grandfathers had died, in almost the same way, for almost the same nothing. The young king, reading old treaties, was Henry V of England, and he was everything Charles VI of France was not. He was young, and he was well, and he was frighteningly certain, a hard, pious, single-minded man who had decided that God wanted him to be King of France, and who pursued that belief with a cold competence that the divided, mad-ruled French had no answer for. He revived the old claim, the one Edward III had set down within reach at Bretigny. He gathered an army. In the autumn of 1415, he crossed the Channel and landed in Normandy, and the long war, which had been sunk beneath the surface for a generation, came roaring back up into the daylight. It did not start well for him. He took a port by siege, but it cost him months and thousands of men to sickness, and by autumn his army was small and ill, and a long way from safety, marching for Calais through hostile country with the rains coming down. It was Poitiers all over again in its shape, a small, tired English army deep in France, cut off, with a great French host gathering to destroy it. The French had every advantage. They had the numbers overwhelmingly. They had the fresh troops and the home ground. They had their enemy trapped and exhausted and outnumbered perhaps 4 or 5 to 1. They also had, waiting in their own ranks, the ghost of a lesson 3 generations old, and they did not heed it. Because here is the thing that makes Agincourt almost unbearable to tell. The French knew about the longbow. They knew about Crecy. It was in their chronicles, their family histories. Some of the men on that field had grandfathers who had died under the English arrows 70 years before. They knew about Poitiers, where a French king had been taken doing exactly this. The catastrophe was not new to them. It was written down. It was remembered. And they rode into it anyway, because the thing that had killed their ancestors was the same thing that made them who they were, and they could no more give it up than give up their names. The field was the trap. Henry chose his ground as Edward and the Black Prince had chosen theirs. A narrow place, woods on either side, a funnel that would squeeze the vast French numbers into a front no wider than the small English line. And it had rained for days. The ground between the armies was deep, soft, churned mud, the kind that pulls the boot off a walking man. The French men-at-arms, in full plate armor, would have to cross that mud on foot, uphill, into the arrows, packed so tight by the narrowing field that they could barely raise their arms. It was a slaughter, and it was a slow one. The arrows came, as they had at Crécy, as they had at Poitiers, darkening the sky and falling into the crowded French ranks that had nowhere to spread and nowhere to hide. But it was the mud that made Agincourt its own particular nightmare. The French, driven forward, sinking to their knees and their thighs, exhausted before they reached the English line, arrived so tightly packed and so spent that they could barely fight. Men fell and could not rise in the press and the mud, and more men fell on top of them, and in places the dead and the trapped living piled up into heaps taller than a man, and the French at the bottom drowned in the mud and the weight, smothered under their own charging army, without an English hand ever touching them. The most heavily armored men in Europe, the flower of French nobility, died face down in a wet field, crushed and airless, killed by their own numbers and their own weight and their own refusal to learn. The English, lightly armored, moving easily where the French floundered, waded into the stranded mass with hatchets and mallets and knives, and did butcher's work. When it was over, the dead were counted in the thousands, and they were once again the names of France. Dukes, counts, the great lords, an entire generation of French leadership wiped out in an afternoon on a muddy field they had not needed to fight on at all. And that is the horror of Agincourt, deeper than the mud. It had all happened before. Twice. This was the third time the chivalry of France had thrown itself onto the English arrows and been annihilated. The third time in the span of one long war. And between the first time and this one lay 70 years, in which nothing apparently had been learned. Crecy should have been the lesson. Poitiers should have been the lesson repeated, underlined, with a captured king to make the point unmistakable. And here, 3 generations on, the great-grandsons of the men who died at Crecy did it again, in the same way, for the same reasons, and died the same death. Why? Because the war had gone on so long that it had become the thing it was fighting to preserve. The whole point of being a noble, the whole justification for the order that set some men above others, was that the noble fought, rode to war on his armored horse, and proved his worth in the charge. To refuse that, to fight some other, safer, cleverer way, was to stop being what you were. Charles V and Du Guesclin had shown that the cleverer way won. It had won them back a third of France. But that lesson died with them, because it asked the nobility to stop being noble, and they would rather die in the mud than do that. So they died in the mud. For the land, Agincourt was one more field turned to a graveyard, one more good stretch of Norman ground fed with the bodies of men who should have been somewhere else. The local people would have come out afterward, as they always did, to bury what could be buried and strip what could be stripped, to deal with the aftermath of a battle the way their ancestors had dealt with Crecy, a thing that happened to their fields from time to time, like a flood, like a hard winter, a disaster that came from the world of kings and settled on the world of farmers. Henry V had his miracle. A small trapped English army had destroyed a great French one, and the news of it went across Europe, and the young king came home a legend, the new Edward, the new Black Prince, the Englishman whom God so obviously favored that he could shatter France with a handful of sick men in the rain. It made him unstoppable. It made the impossible thing, an English king actually ruling France, suddenly look not just possible, but ordained. And a France that was already tearing itself in half, ruled by a king made of glass, with the flower of its nobility face down in the mud of Agincourt, had almost nothing left to stop him. The claim Edward III had set down within reach 80 years before was about to be picked up all the way. Henry was not going to settle for a third of France, the way Bretigny had. He was going to take the crown itself, the whole thing, the throne, the anointing, everything the war had ever been about. And a broken France was about to hand it to him. The king who signed France away did not always know his own name. Charles VI had worn the crown of France for most of his life, and for most of that life he had been mad. It came and went. There were long spells when he ruled as well as any king, and then the dark would fall over him without warning, and he would not know his wife or his children or himself. In the worst of it, he believed he was made of glass and would let no one touch him for fear of shattering. There were times he did not know he was king at all. Around this broken man, unable to govern and unable to die, the kingdom of France had been quietly tearing itself in two. For France was not only fighting England now, France was fighting France. The great lords had split into two camps that hated each other more than either hated the enemy across the water. On one side stood the party of the king's own family and their allies. On the other stood the Duke of Burgundy, himself a prince of French blood, ruler of a rich and half-independent realm in the east, powerful enough to play his own game. The two factions had been murdering each other in the streets of Paris for years, each certain the other was the real traitor, each willing to do almost anything to win. And into a France at war with itself, the English king had walked almost unopposed. His name was Henry V, and he had not come, as his great-grandfather Edward had come, to burn and to bargain and to sail home richer. He had come to keep the country. After his victory in the north, he did not withdraw. He turned and took Normandy, town by town, the slow and permanent way. Not a raid, but a conquest. Garrisons left behind. English law imposed. English lords settled on French land. When the great city of Rouen shut its gates against him, he did not storm it. He surrounded it and waited, through a winter, while inside the walls the food ran out and the people starved. The garrison put the mouths it could not feed outside the gates to save the grain, the old, the sick, the children, and Henry would not let them through his lines. They died in the ditch between the walls and the English camp, in the frozen ground between two armies belonging to no one. It had happened before, at another siege, in another generation. The war did not remember. The war only repeated. And then, in 1419, on a bridge over a quiet river, the thing happened that handed France to England without a battle. The two French factions had agreed to meet and make peace at last, to stop fighting each other and turn together against the invader. The Duke of Burgundy came to the bridge to be reconciled, and there, in the middle of the talks, men of the opposing party cut him down where he stood, murdered him on the bridge under the safe conduct of a peace meeting. It was meant, perhaps, as a stroke that would end a rivalry. Instead, it decided the war. The murdered duke had a son, and the son had one thought, now, one only, hot enough to burn away every other loyalty: vengeance. If his father's killers stood with the crown of France, then he would stand with England. Grief did what Henry's whole army could not. It drove the greatest lord in France into the enemy's arms. With Burgundy at his side, Henry held the winning hand, and in 1420 he laid it on the table at Troyes. The terms were the most complete surrender a kingdom could sign. The mad king would keep his crown until he died, but he would name Henry of England his heir. Henry would marry the French king's daughter and rule France as regent while the old man lived. And when the old man died, the two crowns of England and France would rest on one head, and on the heads of Henry's sons after him forever. This was the claim that Edward III had made in 1337, made real at last. An English king would wear the crown of France, not by conquest of a single battle, but by law, by treaty, by the signature of the French king himself. The thing the whole war had supposedly been fought for was about to be achieved. On parchment, England had won. But a kingdom does not fit on parchment, and here the treaty did a strange and terrible thing to make the arithmetic work. Charles VI had a son, a living son, grown, the natural heir to the throne of France, the Dauphin, as the French called their crown prince. For Henry to inherit, this son had to be made to vanish from the line, so the treaty set him aside. It declared him no true heir, passed him over, cut him out of the succession of his own father's kingdom. And the Queen, his own mother, put her name to the side that agreed to it, a mother's signature on the page that disinherited her son. He was not at Troyes. The disinherited Dauphin was in the south, beyond the river Loire, holding what was left to him, the middle of France, the poorer half, a court in exile in his own country. He was young and unsure of himself, and there were whispers, cruel ones, that he was no true son of the king at all, that the madness in his father and the rumors about his mother had left even his blood in doubt. He did not know, some said, whether he believed in his own right to the throne. A prince disinherited by treaty, abandoned by his mother, doubtful of his own name, holding half a broken kingdom that most of Europe had already signed away. By every law and every appearance, he had lost. The crown was promised elsewhere. The capital was in enemy hands. The greatest lord of France had gone over to the enemy, and the king his father had signed a paper that erased him. He was, on that day in 1420, the least likely king in the history of France. A ruler of nowhere, waiting south of a river for a war he could not win to come and finish him. He would wait 9 years, and then, out of a village no one in Troyes had ever heard of, something would come for him that no treaty had accounted for. Henry V died first, and he died of something no army could stop. He was 35, and he was winning. The treaty was signed, France was his in all but the final formality, and he had only to wait for his mad father-in-law to die, and the two crowns would fall to him together. He spent his last campaigning season doing what he did best, taking towns, tightening his grip, riding through a France that had all but stopped resisting him. And somewhere in that summer, in a camp like 1,000 others, he caught the thing that killed more soldiers than any battle ever did. Not a wound. A sickness of the camp. The flux, they called it. The bloody illness that bred in the filth where armies gathered and killed them quietly, unheroically, in their tents. It took weeks. The conqueror of France, the man who had won the war on parchment, lay dying by inches in a castle on the Loire, and there was nothing his physicians could do but watch. He was clear-headed at the end. He gave his orders. He arranged the guardianship of the realm he was leaving, and he died in the late summer of 1422, still weeks short of the crown he had been promised, having won everything and inherited none of it. He left behind a son, a boy who had been born only months before, who had never seen his father, and who could not yet speak or stand or hold up his own head. And then, that same autumn, before the year was even out, the Mad King died too. Charles VI, who had believed he was made of glass, who had ruled and not ruled through 30 years of darkness, who had signed away his daughter and his kingdom and his own son's birthright, finally slipped out of a life that had long since stopped belonging to him. The people of Paris, it is said, wept for him as he was carried to his grave, not for the ruin he had presided over, but because he was the king they had always known, the familiar broken figure at the center of a world that made less and less sense. When he was gone, they mourned as if something steady had ended, though nothing about his reign had been steady for a generation. The two deaths, weeks apart, did exactly what the Treaty of Troyes had promised. The crowns of England and France came to rest on a single head. The head belonged to a baby who was not yet 1 year old. Picture what the treaty had actually produced. The King of England and France, Lord of two realms, heir to the whole long war, was an infant in a cradle in England, who would be carried out at ceremonies and held up for the crowds, who understood none of it, who cried and slept and was fed like any child, and in whose name grown men would now rule two kingdoms and fight to hold them. He had a name, this baby king, but names hardly mattered yet. What mattered was that the great victory of Henry V, the conquest of France by law and blood and patience, now depended entirely on a child too young to know he was a king at all. For a while, astonishingly, it held. The dead king's brother took up the war in the baby's name and ran it well. A capable, hard soldier who kept the English machine moving, kept Burgundy loyal, kept pressing south. The treaty held. The armies held. The conquest ground forward as if the conqueror was still alive, because enough able men had an interest in pretending he was. And the pressing south led at last to a river and a city on it, and the door that city guarded. The river was the Loire, the wide, slow water that cut across the middle of France and divided the country the war had made. North of it, England ruled, Paris, Normandy, the rich heartland, held by English garrisons and Burgundian allies. South of it lay everything the disinherited Dauphin still held, the poorer half, the last France that had not submitted. The river was the line between the two, and along that line stood a city that was the great lock on the whole southern door. Its name was Orléans. If Orléans fell, the road south lay open. The English could cross the river in force, pour into the lands the Dauphin still held, and finish the thing. Take the last France, hunt down the last claimant, and make the baby's two crowns whole in fact, as they already were in law. Everyone understood this. Orléans was not just a city. It was the final wall between the English conquest and its completion. In the autumn of 1428, the English army came to Orléans and began the siege that was meant to end the war. They ringed the city with forts and earthworks, the slow, strangling method that had taken Calais and Rouen, the patient arithmetic of hunger that the English had raised to an art. Inside the walls, the people of Orléans dug in to endure it, as the people of so many towns had endured it before them, knowing what a siege meant, knowing how these things usually ended. Outside, the Dauphin's cause looked thinner every week. He had no money to speak of, an army that would not be paid, captains who quarreled, and a growing sense across his shrinking realm that the war was simply lost, that God had turned his face away from the House of France, that the treaty had been right, that the boy across the water was the true king after all, and the man south of the Loire was a pretender clinging to the last of a kingdom that no longer wanted him. The siege dragged into the winter and then into the spring. The forts tightened, the food thinned, and in the Dauphin's court, men began to speak of giving up the fight, of fleeing south of everything, of abandoning the whole cause and letting the war end the way it so obviously wanted to end. It was at this moment, with the last door closing, that a girl arrived at the Dauphin's court and asked to be given an army. She was 17, and she could not read, and she said the voices had been speaking to her since she was 13. She came out of a village called Domremy, on the eastern edge of the kingdom, a place of no importance that no one at court had ever heard of. Her father worked the land. She had grown up in the war the way everyone her age had grown up in it, as weather, as the thing that had always been happening, the burnings and the soldiers and the fear that came up the road every few years and then receded. She had never known of France at peace. No one under 90 had. And somewhere in her childhood, in the fields around that village, she began to hear them. Voices, she said. Saints, she said, speaking to her plainly, telling her a thing so large and so absurd that saying it aloud should have ended her in a madhouse or worse. They told her that God had chosen her, that she was to take up arms and drive the English out of France and bring the disinherited prince to his crown. A farm girl, 17 years old, who had never held a sword, never sat a war horse, never stood within a mile of a battle. What is impossible to explain from 6 centuries away is not that she believed it. Children believe things. What is impossible to explain is that she made everyone else believe it too. She talked her way to the local garrison, and then, against every reason, they gave her an escort. She rode across hundreds of miles of hostile country, through territory crawling with enemy soldiers, dressed as a man for safety, to reach the Dauphin's court in the south. And when she got there, a peasant girl demanding an audience with the heir to the throne of France at the lowest and most desperate hour of his cause, they let her in. He tested her first. The story goes that he hid himself among his courtiers and put another man on the throne to see if she was truly guided or merely mad. And she crossed the room, past the false king, and knelt to the real one, to the doubtful, disinherited man who was not sure he believed in his own blood. She knew him. However she knew him, and she told him what her voices had told her, that he was the true king, the real heir, that his birth was no lie, and that God had sent her to see him crowned. Think of what those words did to that particular man. Here was a prince who had been disinherited by treaty, abandoned by his own mother, whispered about as a bastard, uncertain to the depths of himself whether he had any right to the throne at all, and a girl who could not possibly have known him, who had come out of nowhere, looked at him and told him with total certainty that he was who he feared he was not. She did not bring him an army. She brought him something he needed more. She brought him belief in himself. They did not quite know what to do with her. The theologians questioned her for weeks, probing for heresy, for madness, for fraud, and found, to their evident surprise, a plain, sharp, unshakable girl who answered their traps better than they set them. In the end, desperation decided it. The cause was lost anyway. Orléans was starving. There was nothing left to try that ordinary men had not already failed at. So they gave her what she asked for. They gave her armor and a banner, and a place at the head of an army marching to relieve the last great city of the south. And here, the whole vast machinery of this story, the kings and the treaties, the sieges and the burnings, 90 years of it grinding forward like a thing that could not be turned, narrows to a single figure on a white horse, riding toward Orléans. Her name was Joan. She reached the city in the spring of 1429, and everything about the war began, impossibly, to move the other way. She was not a general. She did not plan the battles in any way the captains recognized, and they resented her and worked around her, and she pushed forward anyway, into the fighting, banner high, where the men could see her, taking wounds and rising and pressing on. What she brought was not tactics, it was conviction, poured into an army that had forgotten it could win. Men who had been ready to run followed a teenage girl into the English forts because she was so completely certain that God was on their side that the certainty became contagious. The forts fell, one after another. The ring of English earthworks that had strangled Orléans all winter was stormed and taken, in a matter of days, by an army that a week before had been talking of surrender. She was wounded. An arrow through the shoulder, pulled it out herself, some said, and went back to the line. And the English, who had been winning this war for 100 years, who had broken French armies at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, who had never been given a reason to doubt that God and the longbow were both on their side, looked up at the walls of Orléans and saw their siege collapsing under the banner of a country girl, and something in them faltered that had never faltered before. The siege that was meant to end the war ended. Instead, the invincibility of the men who had come to win it. Orléans was free, the door held, and the disinherited prince, who had been waiting south of the river to lose everything, now stood, suddenly, at the head of a cause that believed again, that had been touched by something it could only call a miracle, and that meant to ride that miracle north, into the heart of English France, all the way to the one place where a true king of France could be made. She had told him she would see him crowned. Now, against every probability the war had spent 90 years establishing, it began to look as though she might. To make a king of France, you needed one particular city, and that city was deep inside enemy country. This was the strange sacred rule at the heart of the whole quarrel. A prince could hold the south, could command armies, could call himself the heir, but he was not truly fully king of France until he had been anointed. Not merely crowned, anointed, touched with a holy oil that the story said had been brought down from heaven for the baptism of the very first Christian king of the Franks, nearly 1,000 years before. The oil was kept in one place only. It was kept in the cathedral at Reims, and a king anointed there, with that oil, in that church, was king in a way that no treaty and no rival could argue with, chosen not by men, but, in the belief of the age, by God. Reims lay far to the north and east. It lay in the heart of the France that England and Burgundy held, between the Dauphin's court in the south and the cathedral, where kings were made, stretched hundreds of miles of enemy territory, walled towns with English or Burgundian garrisons, any one of which could have stopped a royal progress cold. Joan said they would go anyway. She said it was why she had come. So the impossible campaign began. The army that had freed Orléans turned north and east toward Reims into the enemy's country, and the towns did not stop them. One after another, they opened their gates. Some were taken, some were talked into surrender, and some simply looked at the army, coming up the road behind the banner of the girl who had broken the siege of Orléans, weighed the mood of the age, and chose not to die for a cause that suddenly felt as though it might be losing the favor of heaven. The march that should have been suicidal became almost a procession. Town by town, the road to the coronation opened, as if the country itself were changing its mind about who the true king was. They reached Reims in July of 1429, less than 3 months after Orléans had still been starving. And in the great cathedral, before the high altar, under the vaults where 1,000 years of French kings had been made, the disinherited prince, the one abandoned by his mother, whispered about as a bastard, doubtful of his own blood, ruler of half a broken kingdom, knelt to be anointed. The holy oil was brought out. It touched his brow. And in that moment, the man who had been nobody, the pretender south of the river, the least likely king in the history of France, rose from his knees as something no treaty could undo. He rose as Charles VII, crowned and anointed King of France. Joan was there beside the altar, her banner in her hand. It had borne the burden of the battle, she said, and so it had earned a place in the moment of the reward. And when the crown was on his head, the story goes that she knelt at his feet and wept, and called him king, and said that now the will of God was accomplished, that this was what the voices had sent her to do, and it was done. For one moment, the whole 92-year weight of this story lifted. A true king of France stood anointed in the sacred place, put there against every probability by a farm girl who heard voices, and for one bright hour it must have seemed that the war had found its meaning at last, that God had spoken, that the rightful king was restored, that the long nightmare was ending in a miracle. Hold that moment, because the war will not let it last. If you have come this far, through the fire and the plague and the long grinding years, all the way to this cathedral, then you already know the quiet rhythm of this channel, and you know these stories only arrive because someone chose to let them. If you would like them to keep finding you, follow the Quiet Archive wherever you are listening now, on YouTube or in your player of choice. It costs nothing, and it means more than you would think. It is the whole of how a quiet thing like this survives. Now, back to the cathedral, and the crowned king, and the girl weeping at his feet while a war he thought was ending gathered itself to go on. Because a crown, it turned out, was not the same as a victory. Charles VII was king now, truly and sacredly king, and that changed less than everyone in the cathedral wanted to believe. Paris was still held against him. The English still ruled the north. Burgundy was still the enemy, still allied to the invader, still holding half of France. The baby king across the water still wore the same two crowns in English eyes, and his armies had not gone anywhere. The anointing had settled the question of who was the true king. It had not settled the war. Those were, it turned out, two different things, and the war was the harder one. And the new king, safely crowned, began almost at once to become a different man toward the girl who had crowned him. He had what he needed from her now. She had given him Orléans, and given him Reims, and given him back his belief in his own blood. And a king restored to certainty no longer needs the strange, embarrassing, uncontrollable miracle that restored him. She wanted to march on Paris, to finish it, to drive the English out as the voices had told her. The court around the king wanted more and more to negotiate, to consolidate, to be rid of the war, and perhaps to be rid of her. She would march on anyway, she always did. But the certainty had shifted under her feet, and the same king she had lifted onto the throne would, when the moment came, do very little to save her. The miracle had a little time left in it, not much, and it was running out faster than the girl who carried it could see. The miracle was captured on a spring evening outside a town called Compiègne, and the man she had made king did nothing to get her back. It happened the way small disasters happen in war, not in a great battle, but in a skirmish, a sortie outside a besieged town, a moment of bad timing. She was covering the retreat, the last one in as the gates were closing, and the gates closed too soon, or she was cut off, or the press of the enemy caught her, and she was pulled from her horse and taken. And it was over that quickly. The girl who had ridden through 100 miles of enemy country and stormed the forts of Orléans was a prisoner in a field, and the war moved on around her. She was taken by Burgundian soldiers, and here the cold machinery began to turn. A prisoner of her value could be ransomed, and everyone understood that a king ransomed his own. Kings paid fortunes to recover captured nobles. It was simply what was done. Charles VII, whom she had crowned not 2 years before, who owed his throne and his very belief in himself to her, Charles VII did not pay. He did not offer. He did not, as far as anyone recorded, so much as try. The silence from his court was total, and it was an answer. So the Burgundians sold her to the English. The English wanted her badly, and they wanted her for a particular reason. They could not simply kill her, or rather, killing her was not enough. She had done something more dangerous than win battles. She had made their defeats look like the judgment of God, had crowned a rival king and called it heaven's will. And if that were true, then the English cause was not merely losing, it was damned. They needed to prove it was not true. They needed to prove that the voices she heard came not from God but from the devil, that the girl was not a saint but a witch, that the whole miracle was a lie. And so they did not execute her. They put her on trial. The trial was held at Rouen, in Normandy, in the heart of English France, before a court of churchmen who understood very well what verdict was wanted of them. It was meant to be a formality dressed as justice, a foregone conclusion given the shape of law. And for months, against all of it, a 19-year-old peasant girl who could not read held her own. They questioned her for weeks, dozens of learned men, against one unlettered girl, laying traps in theology she had never studied, trying to catch her in heresy, in pride, in contradiction. And the records of that trial survived. We have her answers written down, and across 6 centuries they are still sharp, still quick, still startlingly her. Asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, a question built to damn her whichever way she answered, she said that if she was not, may God put her there, and if she was, may God keep her there. It was a better answer than the men who trapped her could have given. Again and again she slipped the snares, plainly, almost patiently. A girl arguing for her life against the finest clerical minds the enemy could assemble, and holding. But a trial with its verdict already chosen does not lose. They wore her down. They condemned her at last on a charge that reached, in the end, for something small enough to be undeniable. The men's clothing she wore cast as defiance of the church, evidence of a will that would not submit. It was the thinnest of pretexts for the largest of purposes. And on a morning in the spring of 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, they tied her to a stake above the crowd, and they burned her. She was 19 years old. She asked for a cross to look at while it happened. She called out the names of her saints, and the thing that had turned the whole tide of 100 years' war, the conviction that had lifted a broken kingdom off its knees, went out of the world in the smoke over a market square, watched by the soldiers of the side she had beaten, abandoned by the king she had made. They were careful with what was left. They burned her, and then they raked back the fire so the crowd could see that she was dead, and no trick had spared her. And then they burned what remained again, twice more, until there was nothing that could be buried, nothing that could become a relic, nothing left of her at all. They gathered the ashes and threw them into the river, into the Seine, so that no piece of her would remain in the earth of France. They understood, in their way, exactly how dangerous she had been. They meant to leave nothing behind. It did not work. It could not have worked. You cannot throw a thing like that into a river and be rid of it. Within a generation, the verdict would be overturned. The trial declared the crime it was. Her name cleared by the same church that had burned her. Within 5 centuries, she would be made a saint, and the king who had let her die would win his war in part on the strength of what she had started, would take back Paris and Normandy and ruin itself, the very town where she had burned, and would in his safety order the inquiry that at last called her innocent, a small and late atonement from a man who had done nothing when it would have cost him something. But that was all still to come, and none of it brought her back. What the war had now was a France that had been touched by something it could not explain and could not forget. An army that had seen a country girl turn the tide and then watched their own king abandon her to the fire, and had learnt in the hardest way that the miracle was over and the winning would have to be done by ordinary men after all. The chronicle widens again from here. The single face recedes. The war becomes once more a matter of kings and treaties and slow campaigns, the wide grinding thing it had always been. But it does not widen back to exactly what it was. Something had passed through it. The men who fought on now fought for a king who had been crowned by a miracle and had let the miracle burn, and some part of that would sit under everything that followed, unspoken, the way the deepest things in a long war always are. The girl was ashes in a river. The war she had turned went on without her. The thing that finally began to win the war was not a miracle. It was a change of mind, and a change of weapon, and a great deal of money. In the years after the fire at Rouen, the war settled back into what it had been for most of a century. The slow grind, the sieges, the campaigns that took a town and lost it again. The countryside bled a little more each season to feed armies that never quite finished anything. Charles VII was king now, truly crowned. But a crown had not driven the English out, and for a while it looked as though nothing would. The war simply went on, the way it always had, as if Joan had never come at all. But two things were shifting underneath, slowly, and together they would do what no single battle had managed. The first was Burgundy. For 16 years the Duke of Burgundy had stood with England. Ever since his father was murdered on that bridge, cut down under a flag of truce by the men of the French crown. That murder had driven Burgundy into English arms, and Burgundian power had held half of France for the enemy the whole time. It was the single heaviest weight on the French side of the scale. Take it away, and everything changed. And in 1435 it was taken away. The old grief had cooled. The son who had gone over to England in his fury was older now, and the English cause was no longer the sure winner it had once seemed. And a new French king had come, who was willing to kneel to the memory of the murdered duke, to apologize, to give Burgundy nearly everything it asked. They met at a town called Arras, and they made peace, the French crown, and the great duke who had spent a generation as its enemy. It was less a reconciliation than a business decision dressed as one. But it did what mattered. Burgundy left the war, and England, which had leaned on Burgundy to hold the north, was suddenly standing on one leg. There is a small human hinge inside this. The Duke who made peace at Arras was the same man who, decades before, as a boy of 14, had stood beside his father in the wreck of Poitiers, calling out warnings in the press as the King of France was taken prisoner. He had grown up inside this war, from the boy in the mud to the most powerful lord in France, and now, an aging man, he chose at last which side the war would end on. The men who finished this war were the sons and grandsons of the men who started it. Some of them were the same people, simply grown old inside it. The second thing that shifted was the weapon. For 100 years, the war had been decided, again and again, by the same instrument, the longbow, the English arrow storm that had broken France at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt. 3 generations of French knights had died learning the same lesson 3 times over. But the longbow century was ending, and the thing that ended it was gunpowder. Charles VII had 2 brothers in his service, the Bureau brothers, and they were not knights. They were not born to the sword or the saddle. They were men of a new and unglamorous kind, engineers, artillerymen, masters of the cannon, and Charles, who had learnt patience the hard way, gave them what they needed and let them build. They built the finest artillery train in Europe. Guns that could knock down in days the walls that had held out for months. that had starved Calais and Rouen through whole winters. The great slow art of the siege, the patient arithmetic of hunger, was being replaced by something faster and cruder and final. You no longer had to wait a town out. You could simply break it open. And here, the war performed one of its cold ironies. The longbow had killed the mounted knight at Crécy, had put an arrow through the whole idea that birth and horseback and courage were what won wars. Now the cannon was doing the same thing to the longbow and to the castle and to the whole world of walls and sieges. The war had been fought inside for 100 years. The war kept killing the thing that had won it the last time. Nothing that mastered this war stayed the master for long. With Burgundy gone over and the cannon in hand, Charles VII stopped losing and started taking. It was not dramatic. There was no second Orléans, no miracle, no single day that turned everything. It was method. Town by town, wall by wall, the French crown began to take back the country the English had held for a generation, grinding forward now with money behind it and guns in front of it, doing patiently and unheroically what belief had briefly done in a rush under the banner of a girl. The English felt it and could not stop it. The baby king, who had inherited 2 crowns, was a grown man now across the water, and not a strong one. Pious, gentle, ill-suited to war, sliding toward troubles of his own that would one day tear England apart from the inside. The able men who had run his French war in his infancy were dying off. The alliance that had held the north was broken, and the money, always the money, was running dry. England had bled itself for 100 years to hold a conquest that was now, quietly, slipping out of its hands. The land changed its colors again, the way it always had. The same fields, the same walled towns, passed back under French banners after a generation under English ones. Retaken, regarrisoned. The flags on the towers swapped out while the farmers below watched, as farmers had watched the whole time, another set of armed men decide whose the harvest would be this year. Some of those farmers were the grandchildren of the ones who had watched the first fires, 100 years before. They had inherited the war along with the land, and now they watched it slowly, unbelievably, begin to end. It was not over. There were still battles to fight, still English armies in the field, still blood to spend before the thing was truly done. But the direction had set, and it would not turn again. After 100 years of a war that swallowed every advantage and repaid nothing, one side had at last begun, decisively, to win. 2 battles remained, and the first of them would kill the longbow for good. For 100 years, the longbow had been the answer. At Formigny, for the first time, it was the English who could not find one. Charles VII had spent years now doing the patient, unglamorous work of taking France back. Burgundy had left the war. The cannon of the Bureau brothers had cracked open town after town, and by 1450, the French crown was ready to do the thing that would have been unthinkable a generation before. To take back Normandy itself, the great northern province that England had held since the days of Henry V, the conquered heartland of English France. The French poured into Normandy, and the English, stretched thin and short of money, and no longer sure of anything, scrambled to hold it. An English army gathered to meet the invasion near a village called Formigny on the northern coast, not far from the sea. And there the 2 sides drew up to fight the kind of battle they had fought so many times before. The English on the defensive, dug in, their archers ready, waiting for the French to do what the French always did. For a century, the pattern had been iron. The English take a strong position, the French attack it. The longbows sweep the field, and the flower of France dies in front of a line of English commoners with bows. It had happened at Crecy. It had happened at Poitiers. It had happened at Agincourt, a generation on, exactly the same way, as though nothing could be learnt and nothing could change. The English archer was the master of the battlefield, and everyone on both sides knew it, and the knowledge itself was a kind of weapon. The French came to these fields already half beaten by the memory of the last time. At Formigny, the archers formed up as they always had, and they did to the first French attacks what English archers had always done. The arrows fell. The French pushed forward and were thrown back. For a while, it was the old story, unfolding along its familiar grooves, and it must have seemed to the English that the century-old magic still held. Then the French brought up 2 guns. They were small pieces, by the standards of the great siege cannon, light field guns, hauled out to the flank where they could fire down the line of the English position. And they began, methodically, to do something no one had ever been able to do to a formation of English archers. They killed them from a distance the bows could not answer. That was the whole terrible point of it. The longbow's power had always been its reach. The archer struck the enemy long before the enemy could strike him, and there was no reply to it. No way to close the gap without dying in the attempt. Now, for the first time, something outreached the bow. The guns stood beyond bowshot and fired into the massed archers, and the archers could do nothing but stand in it, or break formation and charge the guns to silence them. And when at last, goaded past endurance, some of them did leave their position to rush the cannon, the thing that had made them invincible was gone. Archers in the open, out of their formation, caught in the field, were only men. The French cavalry, waiting for exactly that, rode them down. The English line came apart. What had been for 100 years the most reliable formation in Europe was broken in an afternoon, and the army that held Normandy for the King of England was destroyed on the field at Formigny. The province fell almost at once after that, town after town, with little left to defend them, until the whole of Normandy, held by English hands for 3 decades, was French again. But something larger had died at Formigny than an army, and larger even than a province. The longbow's century was over. Think of the whole strange circle of it. 100 years before, at Crecy, the longbow had killed the mounted knight, had put an arrow through the oldest idea in European war, the idea that the armored noble on his war horse was the master of the field, and the master, therefore, of everything. The commoner, with the bow, had toppled the knight, and a whole order of the world had cracked. And now, 100 years and 3 great victories later, the same fate came for the bow. The gun outreached it, the way the bow had outreached the lance, and the archer went the way of the knight before him, made obsolete not by a braver enemy, but by a machine that did not care how skilled he was or how long he had trained. The knight had spent a lifetime learning to fight from the saddle, and the longbow made it worthless. The archer had spent a lifetime, from boyhood, thickening the bones of his arm to draw a bow no ordinary man could bend, and the cannon made that worthless too. The war had a way of doing this. It raised a thing up, let it rule the field for a while, and then produced the instrument of its ruin and moved on, indifferent to the next. Nothing that won this war got to keep on winning it. Every master of the battlefield was only holding the place until the thing that would replace it arrived. And the men who had been certain, the knights sure of their blood, the archers sure of their reach, each in turn watched their certainty die under a weapon they had never imagined, on a field that would grow wheat again the following spring, as if none of it had ever happened. One province remained, where an English army still stood on French soil, far to the southwest, in the old wine country of Gascony. The very land whose loss had helped start the whole war, back when the farmer bent over his wheat and two kings began to argue over a chair. The war had come almost all the way round. There was one battle left, and on a summer day near a town called Castillon, it would finally, after 116 years, come to an end. The last battle of the 100 Years' War was fought over a province that had wanted the English to stay. Gascony, in the far southwest, was the oldest English land in France, held since long before the war began, bound to England by 300 years of the wine trade, by habit, by a genuine preference. The people of Bordeaux and the country around it thought of themselves as the King of England's subjects, and had for generations. And when Charles VII's armies finally took the region in the course of his long reconquest, the Gascons did not celebrate their liberation. They resented it, and within a year they sent quietly to England and asked for an army to come and take them back. England sent one, under an old man who was the last great English soldier of the war. His name was Talbot, and he was somewhere past 70, a commander who had spent his entire long life fighting in France, captured and ransomed, feared across the country, a living piece of the war itself, one of the very last men still standing who had fought in its earlier chapters. He landed in Gascony in 1452, and the region rose to welcome him, and for a season it looked as though the English might simply undo the reconquest and hold the southwest after all. Charles VII answered the way he now answered everything. He sent the guns. A French army came south and laid siege to a town near Bordeaux, and around their camp the Bureau brothers built the thing they had spent a career perfecting, not a line of men, but a fortified artillery park, a great enclosed position bristling with cannon, hundreds of guns and light pieces sighted to cover the ground in every direction. It was a new kind of thing on a battlefield. It was less an army than a machine for killing anything that came near it. Talbot marched to relieve the town, and he came on fast, and he came on the way he always had, aggressively, confident, an old lion who had beaten the French so many times that the habit of winning was in his bones. Word reached him that the French were fleeing their camp. The word was wrong, or it was a ruse, but he believed it, and he did not wait to form up properly or to see the ground for himself. He threw his men straight at the fortified camp, into the mouths of the guns. What happened then was not a battle so much as a harvest. The French artillery, sighted and waiting, fired into the packed English attack at close range, and the effect was annihilation. Each shot tore through whole files of men. The English came on and were cut down and came on again, into a storm of iron that no courage could cross. And the field in front of the guns filled with the dead, the way the field at Crecy had filled 107 years before, except that at Crecy it had been the longbow doing the killing and the English who held it. Now the guns did the killing, and the guns were French, and the English died in front of them the way the flower of France had died in front of the arrows, long ago, at the beginning of everything. Talbot's horse was killed by a cannon shot and fell on him, pinning the old man to the ground, and there, unable to rise, he was killed. The last great English commander of the war, past 70, dead in the mud beneath his horse, in front of the guns, in the wine country where the war had all but begun. His son died near him. The English army broke and was destroyed, and Bordeaux surrendered soon after, and Gascony, 300 years English, the land whose disputed lordship had helped light the whole long fire, passed finally and permanently to France. And that was the end. But here is the strange thing, the thing that makes this ending unlike almost any other in the long history of wars. Nobody knew it was the end. There was no treaty, there was no ceremony, no meeting of kings, no document signed to say that the war of 116 years was over. There was no surrender of one crown to another, no formal peace, nothing to mark the moment. The English simply lost their last army in the field, and Gascony fell, and the fighting, after more than a century, just stopped. The guns went quiet. The armies did not gather again. The season for campaigning came round the next year, and no one campaigned, and the year after that, and slowly, without anyone declaring it, the war that had lasted longer than living memory drained out of the world. The kings of England did not renounce their claim to France. They could not. The claim was the whole point. The thing the war had been fought for since 1337, and to give it up in writing was unthinkable. So they did not give it up in writing was unthinkable. So they did not give it up. English kings would go on calling themselves kings of France, on paper, in their titles, for another 350 years. Long after there was any France left for them to claim. Long after everyone had forgotten why the words were there. The claim outlived the war. The way the war had outlived everyone who started it. A habit with no memory left inside it, carried forward simply because no one could think of how to put it down. But the fighting was over. After Castillon, the English held nothing in France but the single town of Calais. That door Edward III had battered open 106 years before, clinging on at the edge of a country that was, at last, wholly French. The war did not end. It stopped. It had gone on so long, and consumed so many, and drifted so far from the two kings and the single chair that had begun it, that when it finally ran out, there was nothing left to end. No living quarrel, no rememberable cause, only exhaustion, and a field of dead men in the wine country, and an old soldier under his horse, who had spent his whole life in a war that was older than he was. Somewhere that year, a farmer in France brought in a harvest. The border of his field had not moved. It had held wheat the year before, and it would hold wheat the year after. And the war that had raged across that country for 116 years had ended at last, quietly, in the same season and the same soil where so long ago it had begun. 116 years is longer than anyone lived. That is the fact underneath all of it. The one thing to carry away from this whole long story, and it is so simple that it is easy to walk past. The war lasted longer than a life, longer than most lives, twice over. A person born in the first year of it, in that summer when the farmer bent over his wheat and two kings began to argue over a chair, could have lived a full and long span, could have grown old and grey and died surrounded by grandchildren, and the war would still have had decades left to run. It began before they were born, in a sense that was literally true of nearly everyone who ever fought in it, and it was still going when they were gone. Think of what that does to a war. Think of what it does to a reason. It began over something specific, a disputed crown, a question of whether a throne could pass through a woman to her son. A king made to kneel for land he thought was his. In 1337, you could have explained the war in a sentence, and the men who started it could have told you exactly what they wanted and exactly why they were willing to burn a country to get it. Edward III wanted the throne of France. Philip VI meant to keep it. That was the war. But Edward died with the war less than half over. Philip died before him, and the war did not die with them. It passed to their sons, who had their own reasons, and then to their grandsons, who inherited it the way you inherit a house or a debt or the color of your eyes. Not as a thing you chose, but as a thing that was simply there when you arrived, that had always been there, that you assumed had always existed because it had always existed for you. A child born in the middle of that war grew up understanding the fighting the way they understood the weather. It was not a decision anyone was making. It was a condition of the world. And somewhere in those long middle years, The reason quietly went out of it, not all at once. But the specific quarrel of 1337 grew fainter with each generation that carried it, until the men fighting and dying could no longer have told you in any real way what the first fire had been about. They were not fighting for Edward's claim anymore. Edward was 100 years dead. They were fighting because the war was there, because it had always been there, because their fathers had fought it, and it had never occurred to anyone that it could stop. The cause had become a habit, and a habit, unlike a cause, does not need a reason to continue. It only needs no one to end it. That is the quiet horror this story leaves behind, if you let yourself feel it. Not the battles, terrible as they were. Not even the plague, or the burned fields, or the girl in the fire. It is the way a thing that began with a reason outlived its reason entirely, and went on anyway, carried forward by people who had inherited it and could not remember why, killing and dying for the momentum of something no one alive had chosen. And when it finally ended, it ended the way such things end, not with the reason resolved. The reason had been gone for generations, not with anyone deciding it was time. It ended because it ran out, because there was, at last, nothing left to feed it. The war simply reached the end of itself quietly, in a field in the wine country, and stopped. And the world went on into whatever came next, without ever quite marking the moment. If you have stayed with this story all the way to its end, through the fire and the plague, the long grinding years, the girl and the guns, and the old soldier under his horse, then you have given it something rare, which is your patience and your attention across a great deal of time, and I am grateful for it. This is what the archive is for, the long stories told slowly, with room to breathe. If you would like more of them, stay with the Quiet Archive on YouTube or wherever you are listening. Nothing here asks for hurry. The stories will keep arriving when they are ready, for as long as there are people willing to sit with them. Thank you for being one of them. And so we come back, one last time, to the earth. Because the one thing that was there at the beginning and there at the end, unchanged, was the land. It had been green and gold with harvest, and black with the torch. It had been red under the ridge at Crecy, and silent under a plague that left the wheat standing for no one to cut. It had changed banners a dozen times, French to English and English to French, while the people who worked it watched armies decide whose the harvest would be. And through all of it, across 116 years, it did the only thing it had ever done. It turned. Green to gold, to bare and green again, faithful and blind, and entirely indifferent to the crowns that fought over it. The farmer who bent over his wheat in the summer of 1337 was long dead by the time the last army broke at Castillon. So were his children. So were his children's children. Whole generations had been born onto that land and buried under it while the war ground on above them. And the land had taken them all back the same way, without preference, the killed and the fallen, and the ones who simply grew old, folded into the same soil that grew the next year's wheat. And in 1453, in some field in France, another farmer bent over another harvest and did not look up. He did not know the war was over. No one had told him. There was nothing to tell. He knew only that the sky was clear, and the harvest was close, and the border of his field had not moved in living memory. His great-grandfather might have stood in that same spot, in that same season, doing that same thing, in the last ordinary summer before the fire. The war had lasted longer than all of them, and now it was gone, and the wheat was still there, gold and heavy and ready, the way it had been before any of it began, the way it would be long after the last person who remembered had turned to dust in the ground that fed it. The kings are a footnote now. The wheat came in.